So in 2012, Alaska passed new sex trafficking laws that turn a lot of the things that people in the sex trade do to stay safe into felonies. So it's felony sex trafficking now for vulnerable people to work together or to work indoors. And what we've seen is that the majority of people who've been charged with sex trafficking have been sex workers themselves, who've been trying to cooperate and work together, or one person even was working independently and was charged with trafficking herself. Well, I think there were good intentions to, go out and find the bad guys, but that hasn't been the way that it's, been applied, and it wasn't really written in a way that reflected the realities of the sex industry here in Alaska.
When you say realities of sex industry in Alaska, can you just explain what's lost? Like what are lawmakers not getting?
Sure. So, if they were making laws about doctors to regulate the medical industry, they would call in the doctors. But when they made laws about the sex industry, they didn't call in the sex workers. They called in, people from agencies that might provide services sometimes to sex workers, people from agencies actually that turn away sometimes sex trafficking victims who are looking for services, and ended up with, a law that it could be used against bad guys, but it's mostly used against people who are working together or doing things to increase their own safety. Well, people could be arrested for having an honest conversation. The criminalization of prostitution really excludes people in the sex industry from participating in these things. And that's why I did this research project, was to try to bring the voices of people who are really prevented by criminalization from speaking for themselves to the legislature and the people of Alaska.
So what are you gonna tell people when you get down there? Is there specific bills that you're watching, or?
Well, we really need to fix this sex trafficking law that was passed in 2012. We're opposing Senate Bill 170 again. We would like to introduce legislation that would make it illegal for police officers to have sex with people before arresting them. And also property forfeiture we want to get rid of. There's a law now that if you're convicted of prostitution, then there's property forfeiture. They take your house, they take your car, and then they say, okay, now go forth and do not be a prostitute. But when you take away everything that people own and you brand them with the scarlet letter of prostitution, it's very difficult for them to get a job or to rent a house and to face those additional difficulties of having their property taken at the same time. It's unfair, and it's not, I don't think, what the legislature intends. Senator Berta Gardner introduced Senate Bill 170 last year, and I understand that she's planning to reintroduce it again this year. It would make it so that people, once they had already been arrested for prostitution, had their names in the newspaper and, the charge up on court view, if they could prove, not that they were a victim of sex trafficking under any definition of sex trafficking that already exists, which we have so many already, but if they could prove that they had been forced into prostitution with the use of physical force, and that they had not ever engaged in any kind of sex work at all before, had never, been a stripper or done phone sex or anything like that. If they could prove that they were these morally pure victims, then that would be a defense against a misdemeanor charge of prostitution. So it puts the burden of proof on the victim, and it really, the main the bad things about being charged with prostitution would have already happened by that point. They already have their name in the paper. They're already going to face discrimination because of that for the rest of their lives in Alaska. Actually being convicted of the misdemeanor crime is, the smallest part of that. And it's just really, to divide victims into, good victims and bad victims, morally pure victims who deserve to not be convicted, and then these other victims who should have known better. It's just so backwards.
What do you see as a long-term goal for the group and for you personally?
So we really like the New Zealand model, where it's just decriminalized and people are allowed to work and they're allowed to work together. I think in groups up to like 4, and if there's over 4 people, then it's a brothel and it, falls under some regulations. In Nevada, it's only legalized in certain counties. It's regulated by the government. The working conditions are not very good. For a lot of people report that they're not very good. And the workers have no ability to negotiate in Nevada for their own labor conditions, their own safe work conditions. And we really, people who are in the sex industry in Alaska need to be able to negotiate their own work conditions.
And what's your involvement with this issue? Why do you care enough to push for this? What's your background?
Well, I've had a variety of experiences with sex trafficking and sex work in Alaska, and then I've been doing this research project as part of my graduate program at UAF for the last 1.5 or 2 now.
Yeah. Could you speak to some of the experiences and just to explain? I mean, what do you mean by that?
No.
No. Is it for, I guess, why do you not feel comfortable talking about it? Is it for legal reasons or why is that?
Because it's a serious human rights issue. It's not about me. It's about a very serious issue.
Could you maybe just then just talk a little bit about the crowdfunding effort and what you're hoping to get out of that?
Yeah, so I'm going to Juneau, and we have turned to the people of Alaska to fund bringing the voices of people in Alaska's sex trade to the people who are making the laws about them in Juneau. It's at tilt.com, or you can go to our website, sextraffickingalaska.com, and there's a link to it right on the front page.
And how much have you gotten so far?
I think we have about $700, maybe $800 so far.